Jonathan Jones, who comes to us live from Commanders Camp, but this is the big news of the offseason, from 6 games to 11 games, and this is it, JJ. What more can you tell us?
Well, it's 11 games, and it's interesting because a lot of people that I'd spoken to in the past week were thinking it would be around 12 games. Why 12 games? Because 12 games would keep him out of the Houston Texans game, but I started hearing actually it may actually be 11. The fine was always going to be hefty, and speaking with sources with the league, with the union, around Deshaun, around the Cleveland Browns, what became apparent were there were 2 sticking points with the NFL. Number one, they did not feel that Deshaun Watson had expressed any sort of remorse or contrition. And so the NFL did not like that, and they were going to go aggressively at Deshaun to get the sort of punishment that they were hoping for when they started this process with Judge Sue L. Robinson. And then the other point, of course, it was about the fine. It was about the money that when he played when he played for the Houston Texans and got paid but didn't play for the Houston Texans, that didn't sit well with the NFL. That it was a sort of a paid vacation was one of the terms that was thrown around to me. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but that was a term that a source had used. And so because he got paid upwards of $10 million last year to not play, the NFL, of course, wanted to seek out getting some of that money back, of course, getting about half of that back in the form of a fine, and then mandatory counseling. Deshaun Watson, at first, in his introductory press conference with the Cleveland Browns, had been asked about counseling, and he essentially kind of wrote it off and said he didn't really need it. Like, for what? And then as we heard Deshaun speak more, he talked about going to counseling, and he talked about the positive impact that it had on him. Well, the NFL mandating that in this settlement agreement that I'm told still being circulated. One source told me signatures are still, there's not ink on that paper just yet. And so that's why over the past couple of days, we've been in this sort of hurry up to wait mode. But here we have it, 11 games eligible to return for the Houston Texans. And then, of course, the $5 million fine and mandatory counseling.
So, JJ, kind of take us back and tell us how we ended up here, where we started with the Sue L. Robinson saying 6 games and the NFL really saying that is not nearly enough. How did they convince Watson to accept almost twice as much punishment?
Yeah, it's a bit of a leverage play here. So first of all, let's go back to Sue L. Robinson's judgment. I read the 16-page report, and to me, it seemed very clear what Sue Robinson was saying in this report was that she talked about the egregious behavior that she found Deshaun Watson had exhibited over that span of time. And, of course, the league only presented 4 or 5 cases to Judge Robinson, but she still found, and she used the word egregious in this. However, she said, hey, the collective bargaining agreement, your precedent that you have set, it's really only 6 games. Now, had you anticipated this sort of behavior and written into the CBA what the punishment would be for this unprecedented behavior, I would be more inclined to abide by that. But because they couldn't see the future, she essentially wrote, hey, we're not going to go ahead and give you what you're asking for. Then the NFL said, all right, well, we're going to trigger our appeals process. Remember, in the previous CBA and in previous iterations in the NFL, what you had was Roger Goodell sort of being judge, jury, and executioner, and then the league or the player usually would appeal that to some court. Usually wasn't successful. The Players Union fought tooth and nail during the last CBA negotiations when it was agreed to in March of 2020, just before COVID shut down our world. And they said, hey, we're going to flip this process. We're going to have the arbitrator up first. And then the NFL, if you want to, you can appeal. Well, that then happened. This was the first case. This was certainly the first major case where we had this process take place. And so the NFL, with the hammer that they could have laid down, they could have gotten an indefinite suspension of at least a year. That's what they wanted. They wanted an even larger fine, I'm told. But instead, they reached this settlement where Deshaun Watson will be able to return to the football field against his former team, the Houston Texans, in Week 13 after sitting out the first 11 weeks. And now it's, of course, up to Kevin Stefanski and the Cleveland Browns. How much do you play Deshaun Watson right now? Do you give the ball to Jacoby Brissett? Are you going to look elsewhere? Because at some point, as that suspension starts to end, Deshaun Watson can start reintegrating himself into the team facilities and onto the practice field as he prepares to take over in Week 13 against the Texans.
Yeah, what's the next move for the Cleveland Browns now that they know that Watson is going to be out twice as long as they originally thought?
Yeah, great question. It's something that I've been preparing for the last couple of weeks. I was in Cleveland about 10 days ago and talking with folks there. It was, we want to see what Jacoby has got. Now, they got Jacoby Brissett in the offseason, very much understanding that Deshaun Watson was very unlikely going to be available in week one, the first month of the season. And, of course, they got that judgment from Sue Robinson where it was the first 6 games. But everyone I spoke to in Cleveland said, hey, it may not be that. We're going to issue a word of caution and say we're waiting on the next step. They believe in Jacoby Brissett. I would have to imagine Kevin Stefanski is going to give Brissett the overwhelming majority of first-team reps, both in practice and in the final 2 exhibitions that the Cleveland Browns have. Do they go after Jimmy Garoppolo? That's the question that a lot of people have, and I understand why. They're not going to trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. They're not going to trade for his salary cap number, which is around $24 million. Everyone in the NFL is waiting on the San Francisco 49ers to ultimately cut Jimmy Garoppolo, and then there can be a sort of feeding frenzy on Garoppolo. Are the Browns interested? They've done their homework, no question about it. They will continue to monitor it, and it obviously depends on the play of Jacoby Brissett. If he's lights out there, you don't really have to go after Garoppolo. And even if you do go after Garoppolo, once he is cut by the Niners, it's going to take him some acclimating to the team, to the system, even though it's a system that we believe he can thrive in and succeed if he is healthy. Another huge question that the Browns would have to answer. So, are they going to go to Jimmy Garoppolo? It's possible. I don't think it will happen via a trade. It's very possible after he gets cut by the Niners in the next week or so, and if there is no other market for Jimmy Garoppolo. But until that point, the Cleveland Browns are full steam ahead with Jacoby Brissett.
The NFL did not like the original suspension that came down of 6 games, and most everybody in the public did not like that either. How do you think this is going to sit with NFL fans and just sports fans alike who've taken interest in this case?
Well, you know, the NFLPA really talked a lot about the Sue Robinson hearing and how they thought and felt that it was a fair process and that the report was, of course, made public. And the NFL, again, could have come down much harder than they wanted to because they had that ability. Instead, you know, this is a settlement. It is a compromise, and a fine is involved. Mandatory counseling is involved. I'm not sure how fans are going to take it. I can imagine, like many negotiations, at the end of it, neither side is ultimately happy, but it is what it is. And now the Cleveland Browns can move forward. Now the NFL can move forward. The union, Deshaun Watson, everyone can sort of move forward from this point, and we all sort of now have an end date on this sort of punishment and what this saga that has lasted more than a year and so many ups and downs. I would have to imagine, again, not very much happiness on any side, but there has to be some relief on all sides that we can finally turn the page and get to the next chapter of this.
And Watson going to be able to play this season and potentially for a playoff run as well for a team that has high expectations. That was something that may have been taken away from him had the NFL had their way completely. Jonathan Jones with us from Commanders camp today, but the Watson news commanding our attention here on CBS Sports HQ. 11 games, $5 million, and he will have to undergo forms of counseling as well. The NFL season kicks off on CBS September the 11th. Week 1 have a couple of great games in the afternoon window involving 3 AFC West teams. The Chiefs are at the Cards. The Raiders taking on the Chargers in LA.
Following breaking news on CBS Sports HQ, the league and the Players Union have reached a settlement in the Deshaun Watson case. He will be suspended for 11 games and fined $5 million. That's the latest from our lead NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. Watson was accused by 24 women of sexual misconduct in civil court. Now, all but one of those cases has been settled. Watson will be eligible to return in Week 13 when the Browns take on the Houston Texans, who, of course, traded into Cleveland back in March. As you take a look at the Browns' schedule, you can see those opening weeks where they will be without Deshaun Watson. Week 13 is the one that we're keying on when he is eligible to return. They start against the Carolina Panthers. We take a look at the Browns' trade with the Houston Texans. They got Deshaun Watson and a 6th-round pick did the Browns, and Houston receives 3 first-round picks, as well as a 4th-round pick, 3rd-round pick, and a 4th-round pick in 2024. All right, let's bring in senior NFL writer Pete Prisco to talk about this. Pete, first I'll get your reaction to the suspension. Is this kind of what you expected to happen between these two?
No, I thought it would be a year, and I thought it would be up to $10 million. I'll be honest with you. I think $5 million is an insult because he's making $230 million in guaranteed money, and that doesn't count what he made last year when he didn't play. So $5 million, that's a drop in the bucket for this guy. As far as the 11 games, I thought it would be a year. I was wrong. 11 games, still a stiff penalty, but not quite what I expected.
Pete, so in terms of where the Browns go from here, I mean, they know they're going to be without Watson for 11 games. This is a team that is built to win now. So what happens at the quarterback position moving forward, do you think?
Well, I think Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be in play, particularly if the 49ers release him, which they are going to do. It's just a matter of if anybody reaches out before he is released and tries to make a deal with him. I can't imagine the Browns would do that in terms of trading something for him because they know the 49ers are going to release him, but I think that's a strong possibility. If not, you play with Jacoby Brissett. And all they've said all summer was how great he's looked and how he can lead the team. Well, now you're going to find out because you have 11 games without Deshaun Watson. And not only that, you have 5 of those games against teams that were in the playoffs last year and also some really good teams that weren't in the playoffs last year, like the Chargers. So it's a brutal slate. The good thing is the easy part is the beginning of that schedule, and it looks like they did him a favor, kind of taking into account that it might be a suspension of some sort, because when you look at the open part of that schedule, it's Carolina and the Jets, the Steelers. I mean, it's not a real tough road to open the season for them.
So, Pete, how important is it, do you think, for the Browns to get off to a good start here because of the fact that they are going to be without Watson? And as mentioned, this is a team that's built to win now. You mentioned that schedule, not exactly a gauntlet with the Jets and the Falcons in those first 4 weeks, but things really start to tighten up with the Chargers, Patriots, Ravens, and Bengals before the bye week.
Yeah, it gets really tough for them, and it's a brutal division. I mean, you look at them in that division, the Bengals are the best team in the division. I think the Ravens are the second best team in the division, and the Browns, without Deshaun Watson, might be the 4th team in the division. That's how different they are without him. Now, do I think he's a star of stars like most people do? Absolutely not. I think he's a good quarterback. I don't think he's a great quarterback, but they're going to miss him because there's a big drop down to Jacoby Brissett. Kevin Stefanski's brilliant when it comes to running offensive football. You know they want to run it. You want to make it easy on the quarterback. They will do that for Jacoby Brissett. And he'll have some plays with the way they run that scheme where he'll look really good. But I think in the long run, they're going to be a much different offense than they would have been with Deshaun Watson. And if they can get through the 11 games with 5 victories, that would be a huge accomplishment.
Pete, when you look at the odds, I mean, obviously all the odds taken off the board because of the fact that the Deshaun suspension is now, of course, finalized at 11 games. But when you look before the suspension, their odds to win the division at 4-1, to win the AFC 13-1. To win a championship, 25-1. I mean, how do you see things changing in terms of the odds right now without Watson for 11 games?
Oh, they're going to go up. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They have to go up. Anybody who thinks that team can win a Super Bowl or even the division without Deshaun Watson playing 11 games is crazy. So I don't think they're going to win the division. I don't think those odds will stay the same. I think they're going to really go up. Here's the other thing. He did not look very good last week. Now, I know it's the preseason, but when you don't play football for a long time, it impacts you. So now we're talking about an entire season plus 11 games before he gets back. And everybody's going to say, oh, he'll just step in and be the same guy. Well, you can't count on that either. You don't know. Practice is one thing. Games are different. So this could be a scenario where the Browns struggle this season, and then they say, okay, it's all behind me. Let's move forward next season.
Pete, if you're a Browns fan, are you happy with this decision or are you unhappy?
With the suspension or with the signing? I mean, you can look at it either way.
Right.
I mean, the suspension, they're probably okay. They probably thought he'd get less, but they're okay with it, the fact that he's going to be back. The signing, you're talking about $230 million of guaranteed money for a guy who probably will not have played, well, he won't have played for almost 2 seasons, and by the time he probably plays meaningful games, it's going to be 3. It'll be next year. So that's a long time to have your quarterback sit out. It could pay off in the long run. I personally think he's a tad on the overrated side. I think he's a good quarterback, not a great quarterback, and he's getting paid like a great quarterback.
Senior NFL writer Pete Prisco joining us to discuss the breaking news. Deshaun Watson's suspension has been finalized at 11 games and a fine of $5 million. Thanks.
Deshaun Watson reaching a settlement along with the Players Union and the league. It's an 11-game suspension, a $5 million fine. according to our NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. Originally, it was a 6-game suspension. The league said it needs to be more. There were reports that the league wanted more than a year-long suspension. But Watson is going to be able to come back and play this season, Week 13, against his former team in his former home, Houston, Texas, against the Texans. Watson has released a statement that we will get to a little bit later where he says, in part, I'm grateful for the disciplinary process, and he again says, I take accountability for the decisions I made. It's the largest fully guaranteed contract in NFL history, and he's largely going to keep all of it. Just a $5 million fine. We heard from Pete Prisco a little bit earlier, who said he thought it should have been at least a $10 million fine, but Watson and the Players Union able to negotiate a settlement, 11 games, $5 million. Looking at the schedule for the Browns and the games he's going to miss, all of those games on the left will be either Jacoby Brissett or somebody else starting for the Cleveland Browns. He will not be able to come back until after that Week 12 game against the Bucs. Week 13 against the Texans, then they have the Bengals, Ravens, Saints, Commanders, and Steelers to finish up the season. So he is going to miss at least 11 of the 17 games this season. I say at least, not due to the suspension because that's a done deal now, but at least, could be injury, you never know. But not eligible to come back until the 12th game of the season. We continue our breaking news coverage on Deshaun Watson with former NFL quarterback Danny Kanell and Ryan Wilson of the Pick Six podcast. Danny, spinning this forward to the Cleveland Browns. You've got Jacoby Brissett. He's expected to take the first team reps this week in preseason game 2. Is he the answer for the first 11 games of the season, or do they need to think bigger?
He's got to be the answer, Chris. I mean, the Jimmy Garoppolo situation, I don't think it unfolds for the Browns because of the salary cap hit they'd have to take him if they made a move for him. And if they wait until he gets cut, it's really late to get him into an offense and acclimated to a new system. So I think they're all in with Jacoby Brissett, which I don't think is the worst case scenario here for the Browns. Their schedule is a cakewalk. I think the NFL did the Browns a huge favor with front-loading the schedule, and with some of the, I think the first 6 games, it's the weakest schedule of anybody in the NFL. I mean, they should start 3-1 no matter who's playing quarterback. And then you build some confidence, and then you just hope to keep it around 500. If you could go 6-5 around that number and get Deshaun Watson back, I think you're feeling in a great position. If you do anything better than that, I think you've, actually got away with something pretty, an amazing feat. So I think the Browns are all in with Jacoby Brissett, who I think is a good quarterback for the situation. He's played a lot of games. He's been adequate. No one's going to say he's the next Patrick Mahomes, but he's got experience. He's a veteran. He'll know the system, and he's got an incredible run game and a defense on the other side of the ball that should keep this team competitive in every game they play in.
Danny, I think you're right, but for me, the 11 games is a concern if you're talking about Jacoby Brissett because I feel like he's more in tune to winning you 4 or 5 football games should your quarterback be out for injuries or, in this case, suspension. And you mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo, and he's going to be the talking point until he ultimately finds a home. JJ mentioned he's not going to get traded. I think that's right, but if he's out there via free agency, I do wonder, and you talked about he might get into camp too late. There's a lot to learn in a short amount of time, and I think that's true. But then I go back to 2017 when the Patriots traded him at the trade deadline late October, got to San Francisco, and he actually won the final 5 games to the point where we were talking up like what a great move by the 49ers. And I do wonder, even if you get Jimmy G early September and you don't roll him out there until middle of October, that still buys you time because we're not going to see Deshaun Watson until at the earliest. December 3rd is, I think, that game against Houston. The other thing that I worry about, Chris and Danny, is that Deshaun Watson hadn't played football in 700 days by the time he takes another snap, and that rust has me a little concerned as well.
Yeah, and that's where I wanted to go next with Danny Kanell, who's played the game of football at the highest level. If you go 22 months between meaningful games, how long is it going to take you to ramp up and get not only back into your form, but into a form with a brand new team that he had never played for?
So, Chris, I think I'm actually one of the few people that actually can speak to this situation with some experience in it. I played 5 years in the NFL, and then I was out for 2 years before I got back in for 2 more years with the Denver Broncos. Now, I was playing minor league baseball. Then I played arena football So I was around, I was still staying in shape and playing some version of football. And then I came back and was starting on Monday Night Football not that long after. It was October. And I don't think it's that big of a deal. There's some semblance of it's like riding a bike. And Deshaun Watson will stay in shape. He'll still train with the team. And I actually think the 11 weeks extra of him to study the system and to get some mental reps at practice is actually going to be helpful for him in the transition back to this new offense. There will be some challenges, though. Even over the course of 2 years, there'll be new schemes. I remember seeing defenses, and I'm like, what are they doing? I've never seen that before. And it was designed to stop certain schemes from the defensive side of the ball. So schematically, from the defensive side of the ball and the adjustments they've had to make, it could be a transition period. But I think the fact that he's able to watch some of these and get acclimated in that 11-game suspension window can benefit Deshaun Watson so that he's closer to being ready when he comes back. Athletically, the guys don't do anything now. They don't do anything in the offseason where you're really missing a ton of hitting and timing. There's hardly any full padded practices in the offseason, barely any in the training camp. So I don't think he misses that much from a physical standpoint. I don't think there'll be much drop-off in Deshaun Watson's play when he is ready to come back.
Interesting perspective from a guy who went 2 years between starts. Ryan, I know you're not going to argue with a guy who did it, but do you think it's going to be easy for Watson to hit the ground running when they might need him to reel off a bunch of wins in a row to get into the postseason?
No, one of my biggest takeaways from what Danny just said is that Danny is such an incredible athlete that he can take 2 years off to do other things like professional baseball and then Arena League football and come back to play Monday Night Football. That is not my story, Chris. But I think Danny's incredibly optimistic in general, and I think he's looking at this as a half-glass full perspective with Deshaun Watson in his situation. But don't forget, Dabo Swinney said when Deshaun Watson came out of college, in terms of the football player, he is the Michael Jordan, do not sleep on him. And he proved that on some good and then some really, really bad Texans teams during his time there. The off-the-field stuff has certainly clouded how we think about him as a football player, but on the field, he is one of the best. And I do think Danny is onto something. Even though he hasn't played in 22 months, he is still going to be one of the best players on that football field. He may not be that person in December, and maybe even this season, but next season he's going to be the guy that the Browns were hoping they were going to get, knowing that all the stuff that's going to come along with it. They've endured that. They've gotten through that in some sense from the PR perspective. There could still be some backlash there. But I think that the Browns are probably ultimately happy, even if that means this year isn't the year they're going to make that run. Because as we've now discovered, 11 games is going to be without Deshaun Watson. Now we're just figuring out whether it's Jacoby Brissett, Jimmy Garoppolo, or quarterback number 3, because Deshaun Watson is going to be out until week 12, week 13.
Ryan Wilson and Danny Cannell with us here on CBS Sports HQ. We're going to step aside for a quick 60-second break, and when we come back, we will hear from Deshaun Watson himself.
Deshaun Watson's saga has reached a conclusion, at least for now. The league and the Players Union reaching a settlement on an 11-game suspension and a $5 million fine for the Cleveland quarterback. That's the latest from our lead NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. Watson was accused by 24 women of sexual misconduct in civil court. All but one of those cases has been settled. Watson will be eligible to return in Week 13 when the Browns take on the Houston Texans, who traded him to Cleveland back in March. Watson spoke to the media just moments ago.
I said before, I can't remember who asked that question earlier, but I know who I am as a person. I know how I was raised. I know how I interact with people, and that's what all I can do is continue to prove that and show people that. And the people that don't know me, whenever they do come in contact with me, they will know that.
Can you be around? Could you know the rules?
Deshaun Watson speaking to the media after his 11-game suspension and $5 million fine was handed down this afternoon. Let's bring in our NFL insider, Josina Anderson, who joins us via telephone. Josina, I'll start by getting your reaction to this suspension and fine that has been handed down to Deshaun Watson.
I think that the agreement reflects a balance between what both sides were trying to do. And essentially, these conversations have been going on for a while now. And the fact that there wasn't an agreement before is what led to, the Sue Robinson process being activated and her delivering her decision and then ultimately consummating it now ahead of Peter Harvey ruling. But one of the things that I was hearing was the kind of stifling point between the two over that interim was making sure that there wasn't a substantive huge increase in the amount of games and a huge fine to go on top of that. So landing it around this area where it is now as far as the 11 games and the fine total, at least Deshaun Watson's contribution, I think really reflects that. Because, initially there was a lot of talk out there whether the NFL was trying to push it to get it, after the game against the Texans or what have you. So you saw that didn't happen. The NFL still gets its headlines around that time, although me phrasing it that way is probably what they don't want to hear. But at the end of the day, there will be a lot of talk around that game simply because it is versus his former team. So that is something that obviously ended up not being a super big inhibiting point for both sides. But the fact that it landed at a $5 million contribution from him at 11, I think, reflects a balancing point between both sides that they couldn't hit before.
Josina, you tweeted out that this is still a working agreement because it's not officially signed. What does that mean? Could there be changes, or is this pretty much set in stone as it is right now?
No, I just think that they're still going over, just the granular details of how that looks. I mean, this is kind of the first time that Deshaun Watson and a high-profile athlete, or any athlete of that matter, is kind of in this new process by the 2020 CBA. So whatever from a paper standpoint that looks like, or obviously the fact that the source told me that it's not signed yet, just kind of reflects that everything just has to be signed off with the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But the fact that this is obviously what's been reported, the framing of it is that is the working agreement for our understanding at this point, and not expecting a modification.
Josina, Deshaun Watson has put out a statement. The Haslam family has put out a statement. Watson's statement, he makes an apology, but then when he was speaking to the media, he still professes his innocence. And I'm just curious, what do you make of what Deshaun had to say at this press conference, and that, basically maintaining his innocence and saying that a settlement does not necessarily mean an admission of guilt?
So as an insider, and these are things I kind of tweet about, I always say, and just even as my personal reporting, watch the timing of things that happen, watch how things happen, watch when things happen, because they're often self-illuminating as far as what is going on. And when you initially saw, if you rewind back the clock, that Deshaun Watson, kind of abruptly settled those cases after for a long time and period, saying that he intended to, fully adjudicate it. That was the first sign that settlement talks were going on. And if you remember back, CBS 42 HQ, we broke that. It was a signal, right, that something was happening because it reflected a change of what he had been saying verbally. And you do that when you get an indication, and per the process, the NFL had to inform Deshaun of what it was seeking as far as discipline on its side, which was the full suspension of a minimum of a year. So, and that obviously is probably scary to hear. So then now you end up doing something that you weren't initially trying to do, which was the settlement. And again, that point circles back to just the interview that he did last week, where, there was an apology that kind of, came out, and it, kind of came out of left field. Another sign that they were talking, because, that probably, without having to even hear that from someone, just experience and knowing how these things work, was a sign of, consummating this deal. And from an optics and PR perspective, the NFL having that, so it can feel comfortable coming down from the year bench to where they ended up, right now. So my reaction to it is that everything that we're hearing is reflective, one, of everything that I said, and two, it's reflective of the fact that civil litigation is still pending with that one case. And obviously, he's going to be cognizant and vigilant over what he's saying with respect to that. Now, the fact that he's still professing his innocence reflects the tone of the things we were hearing prior to them engaging in these settlement talks, because it is reflective, to a degree of their belief. That's why they came in, seeking 0 games, and they came in seeking something on the way opposite spectrum of the NFL. But when you're trying to come to a consensus, and when you're trying to move on with your life, as he's underlined in the statement, these are the things that you do.
And as we've mentioned, the reaction on social media, not exactly positive in terms of what Watson had to say. He was asked in his presser about the fairness of the suspension and the fine, and he basically just said the NFL did what it had to do, and he said he would not be able to speak about the possibilities of further accusations being made. But Josina, I'm just curious, how do the Browns and Deshaun move forward with the quarterback still professing his innocence?
Well, I mean, if you recall during the press conference that he had, and we were there at the end of mandatory camp, one of the things that he said was, because there was such a lot of, reaction to the fact that he said, to that question where I don't have the exact framing, so I'm paraphrasing, but I know the question was whether he had remorse. And he basically, had something sharper to say at the introductory press conference, but then at the end of the mandatory press conference, he basically said that he understands the feelings and that it was a trigger point in terms of the way that he responded to that, right? So I think that what you're hearing now is still reflective of that standpoint, and to a degree, maintaining that because they have their feelings about what they presented to Sue Robinson relative to the focus point around those 4 women. So I think that reflects their feelings with regards to that.
Josina, in terms of the Browns moving forward, I mean, you're an NFL insider. You've been all over this story. You've been with the Browns. Any insight into what the Browns do from here? Sticking with Jacoby Brissett or looking at possibly swinging a deal for maybe someone like a Jimmy Garoppolo?
Well, that games, or that benchmark at the 11, games or what have you is an interesting one because it's still enough to be significant and can swing you over, below sub 500 if it's not going well at the beginning of the season. And if he holds the fort, it might just be enough to where you don't have to make the investment in someone like a Jimmy Garoppolo. But as you know, the NFL is only 17 games. It's not like the NFL. It's not like the Major League Baseball. And each of those games counts. So my answer to that is really going to be up to Andrew Berry as far as the value he thinks it would be in terms of adding more quality depth to the quarterback room. We know that Jimmy Garoppolo's been to the NFC Championship twice, the Super Bowl one time, I believe, off the top of my head. And there's no ignoring those qualifications, particularly in comparison to the depth that they have with the Cleveland Browns. Now, it's not a knock on Josh Dobbs or Josh Rosen, but those are things that Garoppolo has accomplished. And even though Josh Dobbs had a very impressive showing, and by the way, just a little bit of an insight behind the scenes, it was very interesting to hear how much the people, my sources, were gushing about the performance that Dobbs had in the first preseason game. That was almost like a revelation, the way the tone I was hearing, especially when he doesn't have an NFL start. But, the real test is how does that look over the course of a season? How does that look under pressure? How does that look when you are in fourth and got to have it? How does that look when you are in the red zone and the game is dependent upon that? Everything looks good in the preseason when everyone's 0-0. But when it's not a dress rehearsal anymore, that's when it counts. And at least Jimmy Garoppolo has been in that situation.
Well, the Browns now have 11 games to find out what they have in that quarterback room. Senior NFL insider Josina Anderson joining us to discuss Deshaun Watson's suspension coming down at 11 games and a $5 million fine. Thank you very much, Josina. The Cleveland Browns will open the season against the Carolina Panthers on September 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That is a game that you are going to be able to see on CBS as our coverage of the NFL resumes. You can also stream the game on Paramount+. Breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ. The NFL and the NFL Players Association have agreed on an 11-game suspension and a $5 million fine for Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson. Watson accused by 24 women of sexual misconduct in civil court. All but one of those cases has been settled. Watson will be eligible to return in Week 13 when the Browns take on the Houston Texans, who traded him to Cleveland back in March. So here's what happens now in terms of Watson and the Browns and when he can come back to the facility. The suspension officially begins at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on August the 30th. October the 10th, he can return to Browns facilities. He can begin practicing with the team on November the 14th. He's eligible to return to the league on the 28th, but of course there's no game that day, so he will make his return December 4th in Houston, 700 days to the day after his last game in the NFL, and that is a game you will be able to see on CBS and, of course, streaming on Paramount+. Now, owner Jimmy Haslam General Manager Andrew Berry and Watson himself spoke to the media after the announcement.
I'm moving on with my career, with my life, and I'm continuing to stand on my innocence. Just because, settlements and things like that happen doesn't mean that a person is guilty for anything. I feel like a person has the opportunity to stand on his innocence and prove that, and we proved that on the legal side, and we're just going to continue to push forward as an individual and as a person.
But we do believe that Deshaun has strong positive qualities, and we do think that he's done everything in his power to integrate himself with our team, done everything that we've asked, and we do believe that as he goes through the self-improvement and self-growth process, that he has the opportunity to make a strong and positive contribution to our team and our organization.
I think in this country and hopefully in the world, people deserve second chances, okay? I really think that, and I struggle a little bit. Is he never supposed to play again? Is he never supposed to be part of society? Does he get no chance to rehabilitate himself? And that's what we're going to do, okay? And you could say, well, that's because he's a star quarterback. Well, of course. But if he was Joe Smith, he wouldn't be on the headlines every day. So we think people deserve a second chance. We gave Kareem Hunt a second chance, okay? And that's worked out pretty well, okay? We're hoping this will work out, and we have strong belief it will. That doesn't mean we don't have empathy for people affected, and we will continue to do so. But we strongly believe people deserve a second chance. We believe Deshaun Watson deserves a second chance.
All right, let's get a front office view on this from former General Manager Rick Spielman here on HQ. Rick, first off, your reaction to the suspension, and what do the Browns do now as an organization?
Yeah, I think the suspension, it was great to see the NFL and the NFLPA come together and come up with a conclusion. Take away whether you agree or disagree with it. It's just showing how the new CBA can work, because they went to Judge Robinson first. The NFL appealed that decision, and then the NFL and NFLPA were able to come up with an agreement before it went to Peter Harvey to make the final decision. So it shows that the new CBA is working from a front office perspective, and from the Cleveland Browns organization, it brings clarity. It's finalized on what they're going to have to deal with. So you know that he's going to be out for the first 11 games of the season. Now you can move forward as an organization. Kevin Stefanski can move forward to get his football team ready to play and what he has to do for those first 11 games before Deshaun Watson comes back.
Rick, if Watson was your quarterback and he was saying he apologizes one day but then professes his innocence the next after the suspension comes down, I mean, how would you handle that? How should the Browns handle that?
Yeah, you have a lot of people that are expertise or have expertise in that area, and I think you have to come out and show remorse for what you've done. Now, I know I've listened to him. He somewhat apologized, but I don't know if he apologized truly, or at least I misunderstood it, to the women that were involved in the situation with him. I don't know if he really came out and said that, but he's maintaining that, and I believe in his mind and everything that he said, that he's done nothing wrong, that he was more apologetic for putting himself in that situation instead of the acts that happened. So I would have concern from a PR side, and how our organization is going to deal with how he's presenting himself into the media.
Well, certainly the social media reaction to the suspension and the comments that have been made afterwards by Watson himself and the ownership group is certainly not playing well. But Rick, would you ride with Jacoby Brissett, or are you reaching out to the Niners to see maybe about Jimmy Garoppolo's availability?
Well, I think it's how much do they believe in Jacoby Brissett, and can he get them and manage 11 games? They have a very good defense. They have a strong running game. Can he be a game manager? And we went through a situation I'm only talking from a football perspective, that we went through that with a backup quarterback and got us to the NFC Championship game. And so I think it's what Kevin Stefanski and that offensive staff believes. Can Jacoby Brissett get them to where they need to go until Deshaun Watson comes back? And if not, then you have to look at a Garoppolo situation. But then you have to look at how much money I'm going to have invested in the quarterback position. I mean, they paid $10.5 million in the Baker Mayfield trade to get into Carolina. You've got the Deshaun Watson contract, and now the Jimmy Garoppolo contract. And if you're going to do a trade like that, is the San Francisco 49ers going to pay some of that price, or are they going to have to take that allotted what he's scheduled to make, which is $26 million? One, I don't know if they can fit it into the cap, and two, if they wanted to go get a Garoppolo, is San Francisco willing to pay some of that tab?
And of course, you were referring to 2017, Case Keenum, the quarterback you were referring to back then. All right, so if you're the Browns, I mean, you're looking at those first 11 games. You're a team that's built to win now. You have all the pieces, but now you're going to be without your quarterback for the first 11 games of the season, not returning until late in the season. December 4th is that first game at Houston. So as a general manager, I mean, what are you hoping for at this point? What would you accept in terms of where you hope to be in terms of your season win-loss record when you get a guy like Watson back?
Yeah, well, you're hoping you're above 500 and you're still in the race, because you want your teams to start peaking right at that point in December and play well in December through January till you get into hopefully the playoffs. But if you're below 500 and coming into that 11th week, then you're going to have somewhat of a concern. But I think this is too good a football team, and I think Kevin Stefanski is too good of a head coach to know to push and have Brissett be the guy that's going to carry the team. They're going to rely on their defense. They're going to rely on their run game. They're probably going to rely on winning close games. Just get it to the end there, and hopefully we can kick a field goal to win it. But they have enough talent on this offense just to carry them to be at least above 500 before Deshaun Watson comes back. And then when he does come back, are we going to see the Deshaun Watson we saw in preseason of week 1, which wasn't very good? Or hopefully we're going to see the Deshaun Watson that they gave all that draft capital up for and gave them that significant fully guaranteed contract.
Rick, Jimmy Haslam was asked if, knowing what he knows now, would he still trade for Deshaun Watson again? And he said he absolutely would. Would you trade for Watson knowing what you know now if you were the general manager or the owner?
I don't know. I think when you go back there and you're going and making through those decisions, I know he was there was no character risk with him coming out of college. I think when you're an organization trying to make a decision like that, and this is a significant decision because of the allegations that were presented against Deshaun Watson. So you have to definitely have your ownership on board. And you can talk about the football side, but you have to also understand, how's it going to affect our football team because of all of the distractions that's going to come around with it? How's it going to affect our sponsors? How's it going to affect our fans? Is it worth doing what we're going to do, paying what we're going to pay him, giving up the draft capital that we're going to have to give up to get him? Is it worth that for our organization? And I don't know if I would have done that, but I don't know all the background and everything that was done to make that decision. But Cleveland sure felt pretty strongly about that Deshaun is the guy, and they truly believe in him, and they were willing to take all the problems and all of the criticism that comes with making that type of trade, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, no first-round picks now until 2025. Former General Manager Rick Spielman giving us that front office perspective for the Deshaun Watson suspension and fine. Great to see you, Rick. Thanks for hopping on with us. So because of the suspension, and he's going to be out for 11 games, that obviously means there's some adjustments to the win totals and some of the numbers that the betting sites are putting out via Sportsline. Here are the Browns' updated projections at 8.5 wins, a 16.2% chance to win that AFC North, 35% to make the playoffs, a less than 3% chance AFC Championship game, and then 1.1% to take the Super Bowl.
Breaking news to CBS Sports HQ. We finally have a decision in the Deshaun Watson situation. Going to be suspended 11 games and fined $5 million. We finally have a resolution to what has been the saga regarding Watson's situation. Initially given a 6-game suspension, but the NFL and the NFLPA agreeing to overturn that initial suspension. Now going to be suspended 11 games. And we know now Watson will return for week 13 to face, shockingly enough, his former team, the Houston Texans. This is Fantasy Football Today. Welcome to the show. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. Joining us is Keith Cummings as we see the Watson schedule there, the Browns schedule there. So, guys, as we now know, Deshaun Watson going to miss the first 11 games of the season, going to play the final 6 games of the year. Can you even draft him?
I can if I'm in a draft that has over 200 picks. That's how far he's going to fall because I don't want to spend a bench spot on a player who I can't use for literally the first 12 weeks of the season. You're practically in the fantasy playoffs by the time Deshaun Watson is eligible to play. Now, the flip side of that is thinking you could have Deshaun Watson as your quarterback in the fantasy playoffs. That sounds good, but you better have a lot of bench spots if you're going to take that chance. I can't take him with a pick in the 150 range, 160 range, 170 range, 180 range. Out. Not doing it. You can find other quarterbacks. 200th or later, I'll take a chance on him.
Heath, when you look at Deshaun Watson and what could be at the end of the year, assuming he doesn't go drafted, we saw the first preseason game clearly did not look great, but we hope will be a little bit of a better player by the time he gets back on the field, if that's even possible. But will you be looking at him maybe as somebody that could help you in the fantasy playoffs?
He is somebody that if he's on the waiver wire, probably is around week 8, I would be looking to pick up. But I do think that there's a little bit of reason for caution. The fact that he's going to come in week 13 of the NFL season. Everybody else is in midseason form, and he might need a couple of weeks to get going. Maybe by the time he gets to your fantasy playoffs, then you're good to go. Definitely someone I'd want to have on my bench once we get to that point. But I agree with Dave. It would probably be in the pick 180 range before I would be considering him.
Jacoby Brissett going to start for the Browns. At least that's the plan right now. We don't know if they're going to make another move. Maybe Jimmy Garoppolo, maybe some other quarterback becomes available. But clearly it impacts what's going to happen with the rest of the Browns' skill players. And we start with the running backs there. When you look at Nick Chubb, you look at Kareem Hunt, obviously 2 guys that are going to be very fantasy relevant. Chubb going probably somewhere at the back end of round 2, beginning of round 3, depending on the format that you're in. Kareem Hunt, more of a mid-round pick as the number 2 running back there, but clearly has the ability to be a starter. So Heath, what's your assessment of the running backs now that we know the situation with the quarterback?
I didn't move them too much. A little boost up for both Chubb and Hunt because I think this offense could be pretty good in the fantasy playoffs, and I was a little worried about what Jacoby Brissett would do to their touchdown potential early in the year. Still view Chubb as a low-end number 1 running back in non-PPR, a high-end number 2 running back in full PPR, and Hunt more of a flex or a number 3 running back who has big-time upside if something happens to Chubb.
I feel the exact same way. I think you look at Nick Chubb in non-PPR, you want to take him with the top 15 pick. I think that works. Kareem Hunt will fall significantly farther than that. I think he's in that round 6-7 range in non-PPR. And then in full PPR, Chubb is decidedly a late 2nd round pick, if not an early 3rd round pick, because he doesn't get a lot of targets, doesn't get a lot of catches. And Kareem Hunt, somebody who does, or at least he has in the past. We think he will now. And there's always the outside chance he gets traded before the season starts. We've heard that rumor before too. I think he's a round 6 pick, and Hunt's somebody that I don't mind taking as a number 2 running back in that hero RB draft strategy where you take 1 running back early and then a lot of non-running backs, and then you get to round 6, Kareem Hunt sitting there, you take him, you start the year with him as your number 2 runner.
And then we're, I think what we'll see is Jacoby Brissett, because of the lack of downfield throws, it could benefit somebody like Kareem Hunt, maybe a little bit more so than even Deshaun Watson, because panic in the pocket, we could see Jacoby Brissett looking for Kareem Hunt, who we know plays a lot on passing downs. Let's talk about the pass catchers there, Dave. And so we have a situation of Amari Cooper joining the team after being traded from Dallas, Donovan Peoples-Jones, David Bell, Schwartz. They have, it's really mostly about Cooper, and then David Njoku with the tight end position. Where do you come out on Cooper? Where do you come out on Njoku?
I'm not a fan of Amari Cooper. I'm out on Amari Cooper. I wouldn't take him with a top 80 pick. I know that he's been great for fantasy before, but that's when he was catching passes previously from Dak Prescott and Derek Carr. Now it's Jacoby Brissett for the entirety, or almost the entirety, of your fantasy regular season. And then in week 13, he gets Deshaun back, but he mentioned it, and I think it's a good point. We don't know how ready Deshaun Watson's going to be when he comes back in. Is he going to be at full speed like everybody else in the NFL, or is he going to need some time to really get going? So I don't like Amari Cooper, and the only Browns pass catcher I do kind of like is David Njoku. I think he's a decent tight end that you can begin the season with streaming. We talked about it all offseason. The Browns schedule at the beginning of the year, it's favorable. He's going to get a lot of targets. He could be the 2nd most target getter on the Browns. I don't mind taking him with a late choice.
Heath, has your opinion changed on Amari Cooper at all?
Yeah, boost up for him from where I had him, and I had him, I think 45 was where I was on him. I now view him as a low-end number 3 wide receiver, someone in that Allen Lazard, Robert Woods type range. It is a tricky way to project because I think he's like a flex type player for the first 3 months of the season, and then maybe a borderline top 12 wide receiver for the last 6 weeks. It's hard to value that. I'll value that as a low-end number 3.
And it could be pretty just a heavy amount of targets for him just because of the guys around him, Njoku being the most accomplished guy, but you could just see Jacoby Brissett leaning on him again and again and again. Not going to be a lot of quality targets, but certainly a lot of volume there for Amari Cooper. So again, the news, Deshaun Watson going to be suspended, 11 games, fined $5 million. First game back will be week 13 against his former team, the Houston Texans. Don't forget to check out our Fantasy Football Today Draft-a-thon, Wednesday, August 31st, 6 p.m. to midnight, 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock Eastern here on CBS Sports HQ. Rest of the night on our YouTube channel for our podcast. We will help you win your fantasy leagues. You will help us raise money for the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.